Three personal assistants walked out of Blackwell Tower on a Tuesday morning in November, and none of them looked back. The first one was still on the phone, voice cracking, telling someone, a friend, a sister, a therapist. It was impossible to tell that she had never in her life been spoken to that way, and she was not about to start now. The second carried a box of desk items, pressed against her chest like a shield. The third stopped at the revolving door, turned, looked up at the 43rd floor where the corner office lights were already on at 7:15 in the morning, and said to no one in particular, "Good luck to whoever's next. They'll need it." Zoe Hartley walked past all three of them with a canvas tote bag over one shoulder, a travel mug of black coffee in her hand, and the particular expression of someone who has already decided not to be intimidated before she even knows what she's walking into. She was 29. She had paid off exactly $14,000 of student debt in the past 3 years by taking every contract job she could find. She needed this one. The lobby receptionist looked at her the way people look at someone walking toward a burning building. "You're here for the executive assistant position?" Zoe Hartley, 9 o'clock interview. The receptionist picked up the phone. "I'll let Mr. Calloway's office know." She paused, lowered her voice. "3 people quit this morning." "I know," Zoe said. "I passed them on the way in." The receptionist stared at her. Zoe smiled, took a sip of her coffee, and waited. Julian Calloway did not look up when she walked in. He was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows, one hand in the pocket of a suit that probably cost more than Zoe's monthly rent, reading something on a tablet. The office was enormous and almost aggressively minimal. No photos, no plants, no evidence that a human being spent time there. Just clean lines, gray tones, and the kind of silence that felt engineered. "Sit," he said, still not looking at her. Zoe sat. She set her coffee on the edge of his desk without asking. Julian Calloway finally looked up. He was younger than she expected. Maybe 38, 39. Dark hair, sharp jaw, eyes the color of a February sky. Not romantic, just cold. He looked at the coffee cup on his desk the way most people look at a parking ticket. "That's a $2,000 desk. And my coffee's still hot, so we're both having a good morning." She met his eyes. "Zoe Hartley, I have a resume if you'd like it. Or I can just answer questions, whatever's faster." Julian studied her for a moment. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmth, nothing close to warmth, but something like recalibration. "You saw the 3 people leaving, hard to miss, and you came up anyway. I read the contract before I applied. I needed to know what I was agreeing to." She tilted her head. "Did they?" "Silence. You're hired," Julian said, and looked back at his tablet. Zoe blinked. "I haven't told you my salary requirements. I know what you made at your last 4 positions. The offer is 30% above your highest. You start Monday." He said it the way people announce weather. Zoe picked up her coffee, stood, and decided that the most strategic thing she could do was not say anything else. She made it to the elevator before she exhaled. Monday arrived the way difficult things always do. Faster than you're ready for. By 10 in the morning, Zoe had reorganized his calendar, rerouted 3 calls he hadn't wanted to take, and discovered that his previous assistant had been maintaining a secret color-coded spreadsheet titled simply Survival Guide in a folder labeled Receipts 2021. She read it over lunch. It was equal parts hilarious and deeply concerning. Do not ask about the Vancouver acquisition. Do not mention the name Renata. Do not rearrange anything on the left side of his desk. Do not compliment the art in the boardroom. He hates it and had no say in choosing it. He takes his coffee at exactly 2:15. Not 2, not 2:30. 2:15. If you miss the window, he won't say anything, but you will know. Zoe printed the spreadsheet, highlighted 3 things, crossed out 4 others, and got him his coffee at 2:15. He didn't say thank you. She didn't expect him to. What she did not expect was the phone call at 11:30 that night. She was already in bed when her work phone rang. A condition of the contract, she'd known that going in, and she answered with her name and waited. The Henderson file. His voice was exactly as clipped at 11:30 as it was at 9 in the morning. "The 3rd appendix is missing. It's not missing." Zoe sat up, turned on the lamp. It was misfiled under Henderson Alt because someone created a duplicate folder in February. "I caught it this afternoon. I've already attached the correct version to tomorrow's brief." A pause. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I fixed it and it didn't require your attention. That's the job." Another pause. Longer. "Go back to sleep," he said, and hung up. Zoe stared at her phone. Then she turned off the lamp and lay back down and thought, he's not mean. He's just running at a frequency everyone else finds exhausting. She had met people like that before. Her father had been a little like that. Precise, relentless, allergic to inefficiency. She'd learned to keep up. She fell asleep in 4 minutes. Julian, on the 43rd floor of a building he technically owned, did not. He stood at the same window he'd stood at that morning and thought about the fact that she had already fixed the Henderson file and hadn't felt the need to announce it. Every other assistant he'd had in the past 3 years had either interrupted him 3 times to confirm they were doing a good job or had quietly not done the job at all. Zoe Hartley had just done it. He didn't know what to do with that. He told himself it didn't matter. He was very good at telling himself things didn't matter. The first real test came in week 3. There was a board meeting. 14 people, 12 time zones. One agenda that Zoe had built from scratch because the previous version looked like it had been assembled by someone actively trying to cause confusion. She had reorganized it into 3 clear sections, flagged 2 agenda items as likely to run long, and prepared a summary brief for each member based on their specific focus areas. Julian arrived 3 minutes before the meeting. He picked up the brief. Read it. Set it down. You changed the order of items 4 and 5. Item 4 was going to take 40 minutes and item 5 has a board member calling in from Tokyo at a specific time. I moved 5 up. He looked at her. You didn't ask me. You were in transit. The meeting was in 40 minutes. The decision needed to be made. That's my call. With respect, Zoe said, her voice even. If I'd waited to ask you, we'd be having this conversation in the meeting instead of before it. The Tokyo call would have been missed. You'd have been irritated. I made a judgment call. I'll flag it next time if you'd prefer. Julian looked at her for a long, measuring moment. The kind of look that had made grown men rearrange their plans. Zoe did not rearrange anything. Don't flag it, he said finally. Just tell me after. It was, she would realize later, the closest thing to a compliment she'd received from him in 3 weeks. She took it. The cracks appeared slowly, the way they always do in things built under pressure. The first one she noticed was during a site visit to a construction project Julian's company had funded. Affordable housing development on the east side of the city. One of several philanthropic investments that didn't appear anywhere on his public profile and that he'd never mentioned. Not once, not to anyone in the office that Zoe could tell. She had found out by accident, chasing a budget discrepancy that led her to a transfer, that led her to a project file, that led her to photographs of a half-built apartment complex with Julian's signature on every approval document going back 4 years. She hadn't said anything, but that afternoon when he came back from the site visit with mud on his shoes and a tension in his jaw that looked different from his usual tension, softer, somehow like something had gotten through, Zoe set a coffee on his desk at exactly 2:15 and said, "The East Side project looks like it'll finish ahead of schedule." Julian went very still. "How do you know about that?" "Budget discrepancy in Q3. I followed the numbers." He was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't go in the reports. I know, it's not in the reports." He looked at her. Something in his face did a complicated thing she couldn't entirely read. "Why not?" "Because," Zoe said carefully, "I figured if you wanted it there, you'd have put it there." Julian turned back to his window. Outside, the city carried on, indifferent. "My mother grew up in a building like that," he said. His voice was completely neutral. East Side. 3 families to a floor. Zoe didn't say anything. She understood, the way you understand things that aren't being explained so much as offered, briefly, with the door left barely open. She picked up the empty coffee cup and left. Julian stayed at the window for a long time after she was gone. The night it broke open came 6 weeks in. Zoe was working late, not unusually. She had learned that Julian's building didn't really go quiet until 10, and she'd stopped fighting it when she heard it. Not a crash, not a shout. Just a sound from behind the closed door of his office, low and controlled and completely wrong. She knocked, no answer. She opened the door anyway. Julian was at his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a glass of scotch untouched beside him. He was holding a single sheet of paper and he looked, for the first time in 6 weeks, like a man who was exhausted all the way down. "Bad time?" Zoe asked. "Always." But he didn't tell her to go. She walked in, sat down in the chair across from his desk, the one usually reserved for people he was about to say difficult things to. She said nothing. The clock on the wall moved. The city hummed 43 floors below. 3 years ago, Julian said finally, still looking at the paper, "I made a decision that cost someone their job, someone who didn't deserve it." He set the paper down. "There's a lawsuit. It's settled today." His jaw tightened. In my favor. That's not the face of someone who won, Zoe said. It wasn't about winning. What was it about? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. His name was Robert Ashby. He'd been with the company for 11 years. When I took over, I cut his division. I told myself it was economics. It was. He just picked up the scotch, didn't drink it. It was also the easy call. And Robert Ashby had a family, and the severance wasn't enough. And I knew that. And I did it anyway, because I was 25 days into running a company worth $800 million. And I was making decisions the way you make them when you're terrified and won't admit it. Zoe was very still. Did you ever contact him? I tried. 2 years ago. He didn't want to hear from me. Julian set the glass down. I don't blame him. What's in the paper? Julian glanced at it. His daughter wrote to me. After the settlement. He didn't elaborate. Zoe leaned forward slightly. What did she say? He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Not softer, exactly, but less armored. She said she understood the decision was business. She said she'd spent 3 years angry at me and that it had cost her more than the lawsuit cost anyone. She said she was letting it go. A pause. She said she hoped I'd do something useful with what I'd learned. The room was very quiet. And have you? Zoe asked. Done something useful? Julian looked at her. The East Side Project. That's been going for 4 years. Yes. Neither of them said anything for a moment. That's not nothing, Zoe said finally. That's actually quite a lot. Julian made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. You're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to tell me it doesn't make up for anything. It doesn't make up for anything, Zoe said. But it's not supposed to. That's not why you're doing it. She paused. Is it? He looked at her for a long moment. No. Then it counts. Julian leaned back in his chair, and for the first time in 6 weeks he looked like a man who had set something down. Not resolved it. You don't resolve things like that in a single conversation, but set it down just for a moment. Why are you still here? He asked. It's almost 11. The Singapore brief isn't finished. It can wait until morning. I know. She didn't move. Julian looked at her. Zoe looked back, and something shifted in the air between them, quiet and exact, like a door opening into a room neither of them had meant to enter. Go home, Zoe, he said. His voice was different. Careful, she went. But she sat in her car for 4 minutes before she started it, and Julian stood at his window, watching the city, and didn't pretend to himself that it was nothing. The interference arrived on a Thursday, exactly the way interference always does, announced, impeccably dressed, and completely certain of its own welcome. Her name was Sylvia Crane, 41, shareholder, and the kind of beautiful that comes from money and the specific confidence of someone who has never been told no by anyone she considered worth listening to. She arrived in Julian's office with a real estate file under her arm, and a smile that managed to be warm and proprietary at the same time. Zoe had met her twice before, briefly. Both times, Sylvia had looked at her the way people look at furniture, not unkindly, just without registering that it might have an opinion. Julian needs someone in his corner, Sylvia said, dropping into the conversation with Zoe when Julian stepped out to take a call. Her voice was perfectly pleasant. Someone who understands the world he's operating in. The pressures. He has a very good team, Zoe said. Of course. Sylvia smiled. But some things require a particular kind of support. History. Shared context, she looked. At the neatly organized folders, the color-coded calendar tabs, the 3 books stacked to the left of the monitor. You're very capable. That's obvious. I just want to make sure, for everyone's benefit, that the boundaries are clear. Zoe looked at her. I have a very clear understanding of my role. Sylvia held her gaze for exactly long enough to make it a conversation, not a dismissal. Then she smiled again and walked into Julian's office when he returned, and Zoe turned back to her computer. Her hands were steady. Her jaw was not. She was still sorting through the meeting brief 30 minutes later when Julian opened his office door and said her name. She looked up. Cancel tomorrow afternoon. His voice had the particular flatness she'd learned to read as restrained frustration. Sylvia is proposing a joint investment structure that will require 2 weeks of additional legal review before we proceed. Done. She was already pulling up the calendar. Should I prepare a brief for legal or will Sylvia's team be sending materials? Julian paused, looked at her. You don't have any questions about this. It's not my meeting. Zoo, she looked up. Are you all right? He asked it like someone who was not accustomed to asking and was doing it anyway. I'm fine. The words were perfectly true. They were also not the full answer, and she suspected he knew that. and she looked back at her screen because she did not have the luxury of exploring what that meant. I'll send the calendar updates now. Julian stood in his doorway for a moment longer. Then he went back into his office. Zoe stared at the calendar until the letters stopped blurring. She was not fine. She was fine professionally, completely, without question. She was not fine in the way that had nothing to do with professionalism, and that was a problem she had not been hired to solve. The truth surfaced on a Friday evening, quietly, the way truths do when they've been waiting long enough. Zoe was in the archive room, a holdover task, organizing 12 years of physical files that no one had touched since a previous assistant had apparently decided that alphabetical order was a loose suggestion, when Julian appeared in the doorway. "You don't have to do that tonight." "I know." She kept filing. "I'm almost done with the C's." He leaned against the doorframe. In his jacket, without the tie he'd already taken off, he looked like a slightly more human version of himself. "You've been quiet today. I'm always quiet when I'm working. Quieter than that." Zoe stopped, set down the folder she was holding. Turned around. "Can I say something without it affecting my employment status?" Julian's expression did something complicated. "Go ahead, I'm doing my job," she said. "I will always do my job. But I need you to know that what's happening here, whatever this is, I can't let it keep going without saying that I see it. Because I'm not good at pretending I don't see things. It's why you hired me." Julian's was very still. "What do you see?" "Someone who spent a very long time making sure no one gets close enough to cause damage," she said. "And someone who might be starting to reconsider whether that was worth the cost." The archive room was silent. "You're right," he said finally, "that it's not a good idea. I know. You're also—" He stopped, started again. "This is not how I conduct myself professionally. I know that too." She picked the folder back up. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I just needed to say it. You can go back to your office." He didn't move. Julian. "My last relationship," he said, which was apparently how they were doing this now, standing in an archive room between 12 years of misfiled documents, ended because I made a person feel like a problem to be managed. "I've read about that," she said, paused. "Sorry. That came out worse than I meant it." Something moved across his face. Something that, if it had happened on a different face, she would have called laughter. "What do you mean you read about it?" There was a profile. Business Magazine 2021. She had the grace to look slightly caught. "I research everything. It's why you hired me." This time he did laugh. It was short and involuntary, and it changed his whole face, and Zoe thought, there he is. There's the actual person. "She said I treated our relationship like a quarterly target," Julian said. "She was right. I'm not asking to be your quarterly target." "I know." He was quiet. "What are you asking for? Right now?" She set the folder down again. "I'm asking you to tell me whether you want the rest of these C files done tonight or whether we can pick it up Monday." Julian looked at her for a long moment. The distance between them in the archive room was not large. It felt important anyway. "Monday," he said. "Good." She picked up her bag. "Go home, Julian. Sleep for once." He almost said something. She could see it happen and then not happen. He stepped back from the doorway and let her through. On the elevator down, Zoe pressed her back against the wall and breathed slowly. 43 floors. It was a long way to get her expression back under control. She managed it by 31. The board meeting 3 weeks later was not supposed to go the way it went. It was a standard quarterly review, or it should have been. But Sylvia Crane had come prepared in a way that went beyond shareholder interest. And she'd brought 2 other board members with her who had decided, apparently independently and definitely not independently, that Julian's leadership style was creating retention issues at the executive level. Julian sat at the head of the table, completely still, which Zoe had learned meant he was angrier than he ever looked when he was visibly angry. 3 senior assistants in 6 months, one of the board members said, and he said it gently, which made it worse. And now the question of operational continuity. "The retention issue," Julian said, "was a management failure that I have addressed." His voice was precise. "Current operations are running at the highest efficiency rate this office has seen in 4 years. I have documentation of that if the board would like to review it." He looked at Zoe. A brief glance. She already had the folder open. She slid it down the table without being asked. Sylvia looked at her with an expression that managed to be both gracious and pointed. "Of course, the current arrangement is functional, but long-term stability requires more than efficiency." She turned back to Julian. "I want what's best for this company, which means I want what's best for you." The board's concern for my personal well-being is noted, Julian said. If we could return to the agenda, Julian. Sylvia's voice softened. There are people in this room who have known you for 15 years, who knew you before the acquisition, before all of this. She gestured at the office, the tower, the machinery of it. We're trying to help you. The room waited. Julian looked at his board, at Sylvia, at the folder Zoe had prepared, which sat open in front of 3 board members who were quietly reading it instead of adding to the conversation. I appreciate the concern, he said. The numbers don't require it. He looked at Sylvia directly. If there are performance concerns, I'm happy to address them. If this is something else, I'd ask you to raise it in a more appropriate setting. Sylvia held his gaze for a moment. Then she sat back, and that was the meeting. Afterward, in his office, Julian stood at his window and Zoe stood by the door with her notepad. That was pointed, she said. Yes, she's not wrong about the retention. She's not wrong about anything she said. He turned around. That's not the issue. Zoe waited. The issue, Julian said carefully, is that the people in that room have decided what my life should look like. And they're not entirely wrong about that either. I know what a well-ordered life looks like for someone in my position. He was looking at her now, steadily. I also know that what I want is not always the same thing as what's expected of me, and I've been trying to figure out how long I'm willing to keep running that gap. The room was very quiet. You don't have to decide that right now, Zoe said. I know, but you should probably decide it before Sylvia calls another board meeting. He made that sound again, almost a laugh, exhausted around the edges. When did you start making things easier? I make things efficient. It's not the same thing. It feels the same. Julian Zoe. They looked at each other, and the whole long accumulation of mornings and late nights and unanswered questions was suddenly right there in the room between them, entirely visible to both of them at once. There is a version of this, he said slowly, that I handle very badly, that I default to patterns, that I'm... He stopped. I treated someone important to me like an asset management problem. I don't want to do that again. Then don't. She held his gaze. I will tell you if you're doing that. I am not afraid of you. I know, and I'm not asking for a life plan. I'm not asking for anything that involves a quarterly target. Something in him shifted. What are you asking for? He said, and it was the same question as the archive room, but different now, quieter and more direct. Right now? She let herself smile finally, just a little. I'm asking you to call Sylvia back and tell her the next board meeting is 6 weeks away, not 3. Because we both know she'll try to schedule one in February otherwise. Julian looked at her. And after that, Zoe said, maybe dinner. Somewhere that isn't this building. The silence held for exactly long enough to be an answer. I know a place, he said. Not fancy. Good, I don't own anything fancy. I'll make a reservation. I know you will. You're very efficient when you want to be. She turned toward the door. Call Sylvia first. I will. Julian, Zoe. She looked back at him one more time, and he was standing in his office in the late afternoon light looking like a man who had finally, carefully, improbably, and somewhat against his own better judgment, decided to let something in. She took the stairs, all 43 floors. She needed the time. The dinner was on a Wednesday. At a small restaurant in a neighborhood, Julian admitted he'd found by accident 3 years ago and had gone back to regularly without ever telling anyone. That detail, she thought, said everything. A man who kept the things he actually liked carefully separate from the version of himself he was expected to display. They talked for 3 hours. Not about the company, not about strategy or reports or the East Side project. About his mother, who had raised him alone and who called him every Sunday, and who he described as the only person I've never been able to manage. About Zoe's father, who had died when she was 26, suddenly, without warning, and who had believed without reservation that his daughter was capable of anything she decided to pursue. About the particular loneliness of competence, the way being good at things can become a wall you build so gradually you don't notice it until you're standing on the wrong side. You didn't put any of that in the interview, Julian said. You didn't ask. I should have. You weren't ready for it yet. He looked at her across the table. And now? Now, she said. You're eating pasta in a restaurant no one knows about. Which means yes, probably. He almost smiled first. She liked that. What came next came slowly, because they were both people who had learned the cost of fast decisions made under pressure. There were still difficult days. Julian still defaulted to distance when things got heavy, and Zoe still had to remind herself that saying what she meant was not the same as losing ground. There were still board meetings, Sylvia Crane remained, as she put it to Julian once, a present tense problem I'm managing in real time, and Julian had the grace to look like he was trying not to laugh. The East Side project completed in the spring. 112 units. 8 floors, a community room on the main level that Julian had quietly funded without putting his name on anything. Zoe went to the opening. She stood at the back and watched people walk through the doors of a building that had not existed 2 years ago, and she thought about the version of Julian Calloway the board saw versus the version that had shown up quietly to every site visit for 4 years. He appeared beside her at some point, hands in his pockets, watching the same thing she was watching. "You're smiling," he said. "You paid for a community room? It's a reasonable amenity, Julian. It's a reasonable amenity in a building designed for people who deserve reasonable amenities." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, jaw set in the particular way it got when he was trying not to show something. She took his hand. He didn't pull away. "Your mother would like this," she said. "She wants to come see it." He paused. "I told her I'd bring someone." Zoe was quiet for a moment. "When? Next month. If that's..." He stopped, recalibrated. "If you'd like to." She thought about what it cost him to ask that. The man who had never learned how to need things from other people, asking someone to meet his mother in a building his mother's childhood had quietly made inevitable. "I'd like to," she said. He nodded once, like a decision confirmed. They stood there together while the city moved around them, and a door opened into a community room with good light and chairs someone had actually thought about. And 112 families moved towards something that hadn't existed before someone decided it should. "You built something real," Zoe said. "We're building something real," Julian said. And he meant the building. But he also did not only mean the building, and they both knew that. She didn't push him on it. She'd gotten very good at knowing which silences were walls and which ones were just doors that needed a minute. This one, she was fairly certain, was a door. She could wait.